Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon. I'm Mark Canty. I'm a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Let me welcome you to our session today entitled NATO Enlargement, Force Requirements and Budget Costs. Our purpose today is twofold. I'll spend a few minutes discussing the CSIS report on future NATO enlargement that's being released today. Then we'll follow that with a panel discussion on the topic of NATO enlargement and how this report fits into that broader discussion. Before we move on any further, I want to introduce our panel. First, we have Dr. Emma Ashford. She is a resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Her work focuses on questions of grand strategy, international security, and the future of U.S. foreign policy. Previously, she was a research fellow in defense and foreign policy at the Cato Institute. She is a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and recently became a non-resident fellow at the Modern War Institute. She holds a PhD in Foreign Affairs from the University of Virginia. Our second panelist is Dr. John Gordon IV. He's a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. He joined RAND after 20 years in the U.S. Army and has since participated and led numerous studies for the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the departments of the Navy and the Army. John is also an adjunct faculty member at Georgetown and George Mason Universities, where he teaches graduate level courses on counterinsurgency and military operations. He received his PhD in public policy from George Mason University. Thank you, panelists, for joining us. I'm now going to take about 10 minutes to discuss the CSIS report that's coming out today. Having spent many years in the Pentagon, I've lost the ability to speak without PowerPoint, so I'm going to share my screen here, and give me one moment to do that. Okay, are we good? Okay. Everything I touch on in this brief discussion is discussed in detail in the report itself. There's a 5-page executive summary and then full details in the main text for those who want to dig deeper. Feel free to ask questions about the study as well as of our panelists, but I ask you to submit them through the online mechanism. You can see the overview of the project here, and the purpose is, as we know it, a more secure United States and Europe. And we do that by conducting an assessment of the military requirements and costs for future enlargement, if that should occur. It's also important to note what the study, the project don't do. We're not looking at the past enlargement. We are not second guessing whether some of that was wise or not. There's, of course, an ongoing debate about that. And it's not a complete analysis about further enlargement. Enlargement is not just about military aspects, but also about political. So any decision about future enlargement would have to consider the two, and we assess the military side. The study has been funded by a grant from the Charles Koch Institute. And I want to note that Koch has been a model funder. After we agreed on the project description, they stood aside and let us do our work. We appreciate their support. A key driver in the study has been the change in Europe's security environment. Back during the Cold War, of course, there was a confrontation in Central Europe, and the NATO membership was stable. In the immediate aftermath, there was enlargement as Russia, as you can see, was considered a partner, maybe a competitor, but not the hostile Russia we see today. And there was some analysis, as you can see, about the military aspects of enlargement. In the 2000s, we see an energized Russia, which rebuilds its military, particularly after 2008 and its poor performance in the conflict with Georgia. It takes an aggressive stance with Crimea and eastern Ukraine. But there was essentially no analysis of force structure costs, force structure requirements and costs after the 1990s. And in the United States, little congressional discussion about that either. I don't need to dwell on the seriousness of the Article 5 commitment for mutual defense, although many people note that that only requires consultation. In fact, for 70 years, it has been interpreted as requiring a military response by the other members with all of the military, political, diplomatic, and humanitarian considerations that go with that. We looked at 5 countries. 3 of them, Ukraine, Georgia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, have expressed interest in joining NATO. 2 others, Finland and Sweden, have had extensive discussions both internally and externally about the possibility of joining NATO, but they have not made such a request. We note in the report that Russia doesn't get a veto over NATO membership, but NATO, on the other hand, can decide who it wants to defend, on which countries it will expend its blood and treasure. Sorry, let me go back and just say one more thing here. In this, we note a similarity to the situation during the Cold War. That is, there were Soviet forces in Eastern Europe. At that time, the United States and NATO did not recognize the legitimacy of those forces occupying Eastern Europe, but their presence was a fact that needed to be dealt with. And that's a situation we have today with Russia and its attitude towards NATO enlargement. The report discusses the framing in detail. Here, I'm only going to focus on 2 major elements. The first is the need for forward defense and the hesitation to use nuclear weapons. And those sort of go together because one concept of defense is that NATO would retreat into the interior and then threaten the use of nuclear weapons. Huge incentives not to do that, not to use nuclear weapons except in the most extreme circumstances. And NATO countries all desire a forward defense. They don't want to give up territory. So although we looked at both possibilities, we focused primarily on the forward defense. And then burden sharing. There have been discussions about burden sharing literally since the beginning of the alliance. And when we did our analysis, we split the burdens between the United States and the non-US NATO allies. And I should also note here that when we did the analysis, although we had a pretty good sense about what the US costs would be, and we cite those, we didn't have as good sense about what the cost to non-US NATO members would be, because until those members were identified, it's very hard to say what the impact on their armed forces would be. So those costs look lower than the US costs. They probably in reality would be higher. We looked at all 5 of these countries I discussed earlier, but I'm going to focus here on Ukraine because it's the most demanding. The first scenario we looked at is a pretty standard one involving Russian forces. We looked at 2 NATO responses. We have this minimum deterrence, which I mentioned before, and you can see what those forces might involve. And Iran actually did a study on this. The problem was it took a long time for reinforcements to get there, and eventually the scenario escalated to the use of nuclear weapons. The other approach we call hold until reinforced. That would be a forward defense until other NATO forces could arrive. You can see what that force structure looks like. I'm not going to go through that in detail, but you can see the bottom line there, 18,000 NATO personnel in Ukraine and the costs to the United States. The project also looked at a peacekeeping scenario in Ukraine. You can see the elements of the analysis down there on the left side. Bottom line, a force of about 130,000 from NATO, and the US would provide half with an annual cost that you can see right there. And the difference in the range is caused by the level of military operations, whether there would be any counterinsurgency involved. Finally, we have some recommendations. And again, I won't go through all of them. I will note a couple of them here. The major recommendation is to, as you can see here, assess and consider military requirements as part of enlargement decisions. One of the comments we got as we discussed this issue was that the political decision should come first, and then NATO should figure out the military aspects and the military requirements. And our argument was no, those two need to be considered together. The political aspects as well as the military requirements for bringing that country into NATO. And the other piece was that there are still, even if countries don't become members of NATO, there are still many ways that NATO maintains relationships with other countries. And those many mechanisms should continue. And there are also mechanisms to, as we say, strengthen non-members. In other words, there's nothing that says that NATO and the United States cannot continue to provide aid to Ukraine, for example, or Georgia, as it is doing, to improve their security. And finally, I note that we have online the report, which is now up on the CSIS website. There's a short video that goes with that, and then there'll be a recording of this event also on the NATO, on the CSIS website. Okay, with that, let me turn to our panelists to discuss their thoughts about the general topic of NATO enlargement and how this report might fit into that discussion. I'm going to start with Emma Ashford because she comes first in alphabetical order, and we decided that that was the fair way to choose amongst our panelists. So let me turn the floor over to Emma.
Great, thanks, Mark. And I'm really pleased to be here today to talk about this because this is a really interesting paper on a really important topic. And, for myself, I am so grateful that people with experience in, force posture analysis and military requirements do this kind of work because it enables people like me to talk about some of the bigger strategic and political questions. So I wanted to talk broadly, I guess, about my big three takeaways from the paper and from the study's conclusions. And so the first, one thing I think this paper does that's really interesting is try to separate out the question of political from practical. So to take the political questions out of NATO enlargement and look primarily at the military aspects, what would actually be required to defend the new member states that are under consideration. I'm not sure you can actually separate those questions fully. I'm not sure you can separate those questions fully. The political is linked with military in many ways. Will to fight matters, right? So public opinion is inherently political. One of NATO's biggest existing problems is public opinion, and the fact that I think it was Pew put it recently that NATO publics are far more likely to believe the United States should defend them from Russian attack than they are to believe that they would help to defend other states from a Russian attack. So, that's a political question with military implications. Another one is alliance focus, right? Expansion eastward would almost necessarily commit NATO to looking primarily towards Russia rather than south, as some of its members would prefer, rather than looking at terrorism or cyber issues. You'd need different capabilities. So again, political question, military implications. Even the question of missions. One thing I was struck by reading the discussion of Ukraine in this paper, which everyone should really read, was the notion that NATO might actually end up doing peacekeeping in Ukraine, in the east, against Ukraine's own population. And it's not clear to me that would be a popular or sustainable mission in Western Europe and in the United States. And so, political decisions are woven through the broader discussion, even of capabilities. But that said, I think this paper really shows that you can't separate the practical from the political. So that point that Mark made earlier, some people say, well, just make the political decision and solve the practical problems later. Something I learned during the process of the working groups for this paper is that there was really no public examination of the costs of prior rounds of NATO enlargement. So private studies were done, but there was really no public discussion of what the costs of defending new members would entail. And I think that led to many of the problems that we actually have today. One wonders if some of the war games that happened post-enlargement had happened before, if it would have been so popular. So I think the paper really frames this the right way, which is, Russia doesn't get a veto on NATO membership, but it's up to the publics and the politicians in existing member states to decide who they will defend and what costs they will pay. So that's where I think this paper does a really great job. A second point I'll make briefly is I was struck, even as somebody that sort of worked on this before, has talked about this a lot, I was struck by the scope of the defense actually required for some of these member states. And as Mark suggested, the Ukraine one is definitely the most obvious, but all of them are pretty extensive, require pretty extensive commitment from existing members. So, one stat from the paper is that a counteroffensive in Georgia would require the largest amphibious assault since Korea, for example. Managing unrest in eastern Ukraine, as Mark alluded to, would cost, over $500 billion. It would require 130,000 troops. These are not small costs, right? And they are just hypotheticals, but they are substantive. So there were a few other things in this sort of discussion of costs that I thought were particularly worth pulling out. And one was the idea that even some new member states might pay costs. So we talked here mostly about Ukraine, but there's also a really interesting case study of Sweden, which suggests that in part the question for Swedish leaders and the population as they make this choice about NATO is the fact that they themselves would end up paying substantial costs for NATO membership because they are more militarily capable. and suggests, perhaps unsurprisingly, that opinion in favor of joining NATO is strongest in the states least able to contribute to their own defense, and more divided in the states that are actually more capable, which is not generally a good thing for a collective defense alliance. So that's really problematic. And I think the other notable assumption here is the idea that the United States will bear the majority of the costs. I agree with Mark personally that burden sharing is an absolute necessity as NATO moves forward. But it's not clear that that is going to happen. And so this analysis really focuses on what the US would have to provide. And it really highlights, again, just how unbalanced those contributions are. In particular, that it's not just about who spends what proportion of GDP, but it is as much about what those countries could actually contribute in a concrete way. And so, again, Ukraine is an excellent example here, spends more than 3% of its GDP on defense by NATO standards. That's great, but that doesn't actually mean it would be able to contribute a substantial amount to a concrete conflict situation. And so, my takeaway sort of from all of this is that expansion into most of these countries is largely an additional burden on existing member states, a burden that's concentrated very unequally. And that suggests to me that it is perhaps unlikely to make it past an increasingly skeptical US public. And then finally, I guess, let me just round up with a couple of thoughts on the report's conclusions. So, one point where I agree is, I think the authors are absolutely right. The European security environment has changed in the last decade, in the last 15 years. But I think, it's interesting to me to speculate why that was a surprise and why it wasn't considered in previous rounds of enlargement. When we went through previous rounds of enlargement, policymakers largely said, well, Russia's not a major problem going forward, so we don't have to worry about this. But, to me, that instead speaks to the importance of assessing not even just the sort of current likely defense costs of extending security guarantees in Europe and elsewhere, but thinking about questioning our assumptions about the current security environment, looking at multiple potential futures, and thinking about whether the security environment might change going forward. So, for me, I think that's a really important takeaway. And then finally, I'll conclude with one slightly critical point. The authors make a couple of recommendations that I worry might be a little contradictory. So, to help non-members where helpful for European security, to continue programs like Partnership for Peace and other related programs, and then to strengthen the credibility of Article 5. And I worry that those are intentional a little, because I think the ambiguity of some of those programs, the notion that they necessarily lead to NATO membership, rather than being something, a program designed sort of for its own ends, I think is part of why we have some of the ambiguity over Ukraine, over Georgia, over US obligations to sort of defend those countries or help them. And so I think that question might need a little more explicit scrutiny going forward. But overall, I really highly recommend this report. I loved reading it and I learned a lot from it. So I will pass it over to John.
Thank you, Emma. Over to you, John.
Very good. Thank you, Emma. Very much. I agree with the points that you highlighted there. I'll make a few minutes worth of remarks here to in many of which will, I think, complement and supplement the very valid, points that you raised from your comments. So first off, I'd like to thank CSIS for asking me to review the work, this very interesting, important, controversial topic of NATO enlargement, NATO expansion. So I was grateful for the opportunity to both review the work as well as participate in this panel today. I think it's really excellent work that the team has done, and I have no doubt that now the final product is out and available to people on both sides of the Atlantic, that it's going to be a very useful product for both political and military decision makers and planners, as I said, on both sides of the Atlantic. And both the politicians and the military people need to be reading a worthwhile and valuable and informative piece of work like this. Just background to hopefully set the stage for some of the discussion we'll have this afternoon. We all know NATO is generally regarded as one of the most successful alliances in history. From its initial founding in 1949 with 12 members, it really did become the cornerstone of stability in Europe and to a very great extent the entire world. European nations that had fought each other many times in the preceding decades and centuries now stood together in a formal alliance. And I think today a lot of people forget what a huge sea change it was for the United States to enter an alliance like NATO, because less than a decade before NATO was formed in 1949, talking about 1940-41, right before the United States enters the Second World War, the United States was still largely an isolationist country. You know, that public opinion in the United States, even very shortly before we entered the war after Pearl Harbor, was still showing the United States still had very, very strong isolationist sentiments. And we certainly had a deep isolationist history and tradition in the country. And then, you know, when World War II ends, the United States finds itself in this leading role of the non-communist world. And now it found itself for the first time bound to in a formal, very important, critically important alliance to committing itself to defend much of Western Europe with hundreds of thousands of military personnel. First time in our history that anything like that had happened. Hundreds of thousands of military personnel stationed on the opposite side of the Atlantic throughout the duration of the Cold War. So NATO participation was an enormous change for the United States, to say the least. And I think it's important to note that it worked. That you know, harking back to the remarks I made just a moment ago, this was and has been and still is today a successful alliance. The united front that NATO presented during the dangerous decades of the Cold War was really instrumental in convincing the leadership of the Soviet Union that any war with the alliance was going to carry absolutely unacceptable risk to them. We all know that a NATO-Warsaw Pact war, had that terrible event ever occurred, would have been a true cataclysm for Europe and much of the rest of the world, and it could easily have escalated into a large-scale nuclear exchange. The existence of the alliance was instrumental in preventing that war from ever breaking out. And indeed, throughout the very dangerous decades of the Cold War, NATO did not even have to conduct combat operations. Its focus was the defense of Europe against potential Soviet Warsaw Pact aggression during that period, and it did work, and it didn't even have to fight in order to achieve its primary objective, which is certainly a huge indicator of the success of the whole concept of NATO. In the years since the end of the Cold War, there has periodically been this discussion about what utility NATO has going forward. That periodically is raised. Despite those, you know, periodic doubts about the future of NATO or the need for NATO, the alliance has been busy. In fact, its combat operations have all come after the Cold War came to an end. As I noted a few moments ago, NATO's been engaged in combat operations in the Baltics, in the Balkans, in Afghanistan, Libya, and other operations in places like the Indian Ocean. And this issue that we're really focusing on today of late NATO expansion, NATO enlargement, since the end of the Cold War has certainly been one of the most contentious issues the alliance has had to grapple with. The first additions that were made to NATO in the 1950s, and then when a reunified Germany joined in 1990, have been followed in the subsequent 2 decades by a host of new entrants, which have taken NATO's area of responsibility much farther to the east. And as we know, and as Emma mentioned, this eastward expansion has not been without controversy. And now the alliance is considering several possible new entrants that would take it even farther to the east, in particular Ukraine and Georgia, which are, you know, much of the focus of the research that CSIS has done here. So, and again, hopefully agreeing and supplementing the point Emma made, and I think this is clearly one of the main objectives of CSIS's project here, having a really clear understanding of the alliance military capabilities that would be required, what type of military capabilities would be required, in what quantities, and perhaps also what specific locations these military capabilities would have to be located in order to protect new members is really essential. The 5 nations that are included in the study have significantly different military needs. In the case of some of the prospective entrants, geography would confer a considerable degree of security to them and probably minimize the need for a significant increase in alliance capabilities. In other cases, however, and the 2 most obvious ones are Georgia and Ukraine, the location of the possible new entrants would present significant challenges, in addition to the relative military weakness of some of those countries, which Emma has also mentioned. What are the expectations of the new members? Do they expect a guarantee from the alliance to prevent the loss of any of their territory in the event of an attack by an aggressor? Are their expectations something less than that? The CSIS report raises that very, very important issue. But that's but one issue or one example of the important considerations that NATO as an entity, as an alliance, would have to consider that could drive future alliance requirements and perhaps drive them in a very considerable way. Meanwhile, as we are considering the possibility of new entrants, which could result in significant new military commitments for the existing NATO countries, today many of the current NATO member states are experiencing significant readiness challenges, and they have important limits in their military force structure. So how might NATO have to change? What already troubling military deficiencies would have to be corrected in the event that new members enter the alliance, particularly ones farther to the east that are in geographically vulnerable locations. Kind of to summarize, it was, as Mark mentioned early on, it was not the goal of CSIS's research to focus on the national political issues associated with possible new NATO members, nor was their intent to review the recent entrants, Baltic states, for example, that have entered NATO in the relatively recent past. No, that was not their charter nor their intent to go back and revisit past decisions. Rather, what they're trying to do here, and I think this is a very, very worthwhile goal that they established for themselves, is to examine the possible costs and the alliance military requirements that could arise should any of the countries that are considered as possible new entrants be accepted into the alliance. This is a very important project. And decision makers again, on both sides of the Atlantic need to have as clear an understanding as possible what the implications are for their individual countries as well as the alliance as a whole if one or more of these prospective new members does in fact enter the alliance at some point in the future. And so with that, I'll conclude my remarks and say, again, my compliments to CSIS for their excellent work on this project. And I think we've already identified some issues which should prove interesting in this afternoon's discussion. And with that, back over to Mark.
Well, thank you both. Let me ask a few questions, in my role as moderator, and then I'll go to some of the questions that are coming in from the audience. My first one, actually, I'm going to start with John because it goes back to one of the discussions we had in the working groups, which is, do we underestimate the forces that are required for some of these, prospective or potential members? Let's call them that. We actually increased, the force structure in a couple of places based on the discussion. But you had done a fair amount of wargaming on this at RAND, and so I wanted to give you a chance to talk about, is this about right? Some people might look at it and say this is way too much. We have several brigades, and pre-positioned equipment in Ukraine, in Georgia. On the other hand, there was some discussion about maybe this isn't enough. Maybe we've underestimated. So let me start with you, John.
Sure. Great initial question, Mark. And I think that as Emma mentioned, how you answer the question that you just raised on how large a force or how small a force would be adequate to improve the security of these new member states, again, particularly Georgia and Ukraine, because they are the most vulnerable geographic locations. I think that I noted with considerable interest the forces that you all postulated would be required in each one of these countries. And you know, there's of course no one knows precisely what would be needed, because no one knows precisely how a conflict, you know, might unfold. But again, going back to one of the statements that you all make in your own report about what is the expectation of new member countries? Is it that their territorial integrity would be maintained with minimal loss of territory in the event of aggression? Or is it something less than that? Because I think depending upon what the expectations of the member nations are, that's really going to drive what the required force structure is going to be, both from those countries themselves and any additional NATO forces that might have to be stationed, whether it's actual permanent units or equipment sets that would have to be stationed in these countries. Ukraine's a huge area, for example. It's a tremendous amount of territory, and just the defense of the eastern portion of Ukraine could represent a very considerable military requirement. I think these are some of the issues that people are wrestling with today about how much force is required to defend new members. These are the kind of questions that people are wrestling with the Baltic states as we speak. And certainly this issue would come up even more so with large new entrants farther to the east, you know, like Ukraine or Georgia, perhaps even Finland. So I think you all have identified the right kind of forces in the report, this general mixture of air and ground units and pre-positioned sets. Exactly how much would be needed, I think there's quite a few dials that can be turned there, and a lot would depend on what the expectation of the new entrants would be.
Okay, Emma, anything you would like to add?
You know, just again, I'm not a military force specialist here, but I was struck again just reading through this report how difficult the challenge of defending some of these potential members is. You know, Ukraine, in addition to its size, as John notes, we've got, you know, the potential for a somewhat of encirclement where, you know, Russia now holds Crimea. It obviously borders Ukraine. There's, you know, there's potential for troops to come from both sides. That came up in the working groups a couple of times. You know, with Georgia, you know, just the question of airlift into the Caucasus and actually getting troops there fast is almost impossible. And so, you know, the logistical difficulties of actually defending these states, I think, really can't be overstated. You know, from the report. And I think that's, you know, as John said, that, you know, different scenarios would play out differently, but no matter what scenario you're still in a situation where Russia is basically reliant on internal supply lines and logistics, and NATO is operating, you know, 1,000+ miles from its borders.
Let me ask a question that has actually come up in the from the participants and keeps coming up with NATO, and that is, if you just look at the numbers, you know, NATO outspends Russia by many times. Its forces are much larger, you know, but it can't seem to turn those resources into deployable capabilities. So my question is, why do you think that is? I say, if you just look at the numbers, you'd say, hey, this is going to be easy. You know, you don't need the United States. You know, just the raw numbers would make it seem easy. But when you look at what happens when NATO tries to deploy, you know, it's much more difficult. So let me again turn to John.
Sure, I think this is a very valid issue that NATO's been struggling with for a very long time. And you know, that despite the fact that there's an alliance, this is an alliance that's been in existence for many, many decades now and has some very formal, well-established planning procedures to try to rationalize force type and force structure decisions among the member states. You know, there is a decent effort to do that at NATO headquarters, to try to say, you know, if the Germans have this many minesweepers, how many do the Brits need to have? You know, if there's this many fighter squadrons in these countries, then what types of capabilities might we need from other member states? So I think there's long been an attempt to sort of rationalize NATO force planning, but I think you always are going to run into the difficulty of doing that because each one of these member nations has got its own national preferences. And I think that you know, there's in some nations the willingness to trust, you know, country A or country B, not going to name names here, to provide the minesweepers, for example, or to provide some critical air capability, or provide some critical ground-based air defense capability. I think that there's, at times at least, a lack of willingness to completely trust other countries to provide all those required capabilities, despite the mechanisms that the alliance has established over the decades to try to rationalize as best they can. So I think that reality that I've just tried to describe here results in inefficiencies. So I think this is one of the ramifications of having NATO, the NATO alliance, composed of a collection of independent democratic countries that have got their own national preferences, and they might, for whatever reason, you know, want to maintain more of a particular type of ground force or naval forces than compared to what the alliance might actually need for them to provide. But they have their own national desires, their own national prerogatives, their own national preferences that do result in these types of inefficiencies. And I'm not sure NATO's ever going to be able to get completely beyond that.
Emma.
I mean, yeah. So again, this comes back to the point that I made at the start, that I think this paper does a really great job of separating out the military from the political, in saying that we need to talk more about the military questions. But military and political are just so tightly linked. And one of the things that comes out of this analysis is the fact that when you're talking about purely military capabilities in regards to sort of NATO versus Russia, you know, Russia is operating on its one state. You know, they can marshal their resources in the way that works best for their national interest. Whereas NATO, there are all, as John knows, all these divergent interests, states not necessarily fully trusting one another, you know, states that don't want to provide certain kinds of equipment, you know, and I think in particular, the long-term reliance on the United States, and we've seen this again in the last few weeks, and perhaps we can talk about this a little further. I saw there was a question from the audience on it, but even in the context of Afghanistan, right, there was some discussion from other NATO member states that they might try and stay, you know, and assist with evacuation in Kabul, even, you know, perhaps not in a NATO context, but in just a national context, and found that they were incapable of doing so without US sort of logistical and airlift support. And so NATO has done a lot of work over the years in trying to sort of build up capabilities in a way that reflects the actual sort of full diverse strength of the alliance, but it's clearly not been sufficient because we're still in this situation where capabilities are mismatched. We can't always deploy what we need, and the US often ends up having to sort of swoop in right at the end of the day.
I do want to move on to Afghanistan in a minute here, but I do want to give NATO its due also. You know, in the last couple of years, NATO members on the whole have increased their spending, and there are a number of initiatives, you know, the 30-30-30 initiative to improve NATO deployability and military capabilities. So let me ask just the question again, going back to some things that have come up in the Q&As. What effect do you think that has had, and what do you think for the future in terms of NATO developing the kind of capabilities that would allow it to first defend the existing Eastern members, and then beyond that, defend, perhaps some additional members to the east? And I'll start with John.
Sure. I think one of the things that NATO really should strive to do during the remainder of this decade, and I make this statement irregardless of whether or not they would accept one or more of these potential new entrants into the alliance. I think what I'm about to say they need to do irregardless of that. I think that NATO still has a lot of readiness challenges. And that when you look at the readiness levels of a lot of NATO military forces, whether it's ground units or air units or naval forces, that in many cases the lead times, the prep times required to get units ready to deploy and ready to go to some crisis are quite extensive. And there's been a number of studies. Mark recalls, I'm sure, that during the course of their research, I recommended an excellent study that came out, a 2-volume study by Sweden's FOI organization that was done both volumes were released in February of this year. It's titled Western Military Capability in Northern Europe. 2 parts. Well, volume 1 is called Collective Defense, and volume 2 is National Capabilities. And in this very well done Swedish report, they review the current state of military capability to include readiness in not all NATO countries, but the ones that they considered most likely to have to respond to a crisis, say in Eastern Europe, like Poland or the Baltic states. And some of the things that you see in there are quite telling, where, in the case of many countries, it's the amount of time that's required to, for example, have a heavy brigade, an armored brigade, a tank brigade ready to deploy to some location outside their own borders is measured in many weeks or months, not days or a couple of weeks. So I think that as I've said already, regardless whether these new countries join the alliance or not, I think NATO needs to work on improving the readiness of its forces. And then that would certainly, if that was done, if the overall readiness in terms of equipment and personnel, the times it takes for at least certain key units to be ready to deploy outside their own national borders as part of an alliance response to a crisis, if you could drive those times down, it would increase deterrence. It would certainly be to the benefit of new member countries. And then the next step, I think, Mark, would be that once they do that I've just mentioned, fixing some of these readiness problems or challenges, then identifying, as you suggested in your study, what are the specific military capabilities required if you're going to help Finland or help Georgia or help Ukraine defend themselves? What specific air, land, naval capabilities are needed, and in what quantities, and where do you need to put those things? But I think NATO should start with fixing a lot of the readiness challenges that they've experienced, for quite a number of years now.
Okay, Emma.
Yeah, so I think we have seen an increase in spending in recent years, and that's a really good thing, and it's something the US should be encouraging and pushing for more. But I think, as John pointed out, there are some caveats, right? And he pointed out the one about readiness that I think is very valid. I'll point out a couple of other caveats. One is that I think NATO has, traditionally always suffered from a lack of focus. In the member states are not often all on the same page about what they want to focus on. And so, today we see conversations about whether NATO should be pivoting to Asia, and the US is kind of pushing it to do this, when really it would probably be better for them to build up European defense in lieu of US capabilities. And so I think that focus question is still very much unanswered. Another problem or another caveat here is that spending continues to be somewhat disparate between the newer member states and the older member states. Obviously those countries that feel more of a threat are building up and spending more on defense. And again, that's a good thing. Unfortunately, those states are also typically smaller, less capable of actually contributing to the larger defense project. So that's a continuing problem, even as some member states are increasing their spending. And then finally, I guess the final caveat I'd make is that a lot of the discussions around NATO spending and increasing in NATO spending is still subject to a lot of the pathologies that we've seen particularly in DC, but in European capitals for a number of years, where spending is not directly translatable into actual outcomes because it's almost more of a talking point than a reality. And for me, the clearest example of this in the last couple of years were the people pointing to dramatic increases in NATO military spending in 2020. So many countries suddenly spent above 2% of GDP. The problem is, for anybody economically literate, you know that that's because of the coronavirus, everybody's GDP crashed. And so it's not that military spending improved, it's that the denominator, the GDP, got worse. And so I think that's a silly example, right? But that is the kind of pathologies that we see in this discussion, where it's much more about hitting the metrics than it is about actual deployable forces on the ground. And that's a big problem.
Great. Well, let me go back to Afghanistan, which has come up in the Q&As, and we've touched on it. And there are a couple of aspects about Afghanistan. Of course, the United States has pulled out a lot of questions about commitments. NATO has been in Afghanistan for quite a while, and of course they've been enormously helpful to the military effort there, but there have been questions about the capabilities that some NATO members were able to bring. So let me turn to our panel and ask about, what does the experience in Afghanistan say about this issue of enlargement? And I'll let Emma start, since she began this conversation.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, really, I guess let me just expand on the comment I made before about sort of US capabilities in the context of broader NATO discussions. And really, I think what we've seen in Afghanistan is reflective of conversations we've seen before on other subjects like Libya or Syria, which is that there are countries in Europe that might like to see NATO take a more active role in some of these conflicts, but they are effectively reliant on the US to do so. And that's because so much of what NATO does is basically, underwritten by US logistical and other capabilities. And really, I see this as sort of a question primarily for those NATO member states, is if they don't want to be purely dependent on decisions made in Washington that may also impact them, then they need to start talking about developing those capabilities. And actually, for myself, I feel like I'm somewhat encouraged by the debates that I've seen over the last couple of weeks arising from the Afghanistan question, in European capitals, about whether these countries do need to develop their own capabilities. And I think that that's a good thing and would be a good thing for the alliance overall, because it would actually mean that it wasn't so unbalanced and it wasn't just the US providing these capabilities. So I'm kind of taking a glass half full approach to this here. I don't think this is about US abandonment. I think this is about Europe, needing to step up.
Okay, John?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Emma just said there. I think that Afghanistan, the good news about the NATO experience in Afghanistan was the alliance did come together. That you had, multiple countries, European NATO countries, as active participants. There were national caveats. The Germans and others, had some significant restrictions on what they allowed their forces to do. But I think from the grander strategic perspective, the fact that NATO was willing to go that far from Europe, deploy that far from Europe, is very impressive, and many countries did participate. The command structure worked reasonably well once they got some kinks, worked out of it. So I think that there's, a considerable amount of good news there. At the political strategic level, the lessons that need to be learned, where some of the deficiencies were exposed, was, I'll go back to the remark I made just a few moments ago about readiness. That a lot of the Americans, at times I remember reading American articles about why can't the Europeans deploy more helicopters to Afghanistan? Helicopters are a critical capability. By the way, helicopters were a critical capability when the Soviets were there in the 1980s. Soviets were very dependent on helicopters for moving them around the mountainous Afghan terrain, and they were certainly very important when the U.S. and NATO were in Afghanistan. So you'd see these American writers and commentators bemoaning the fact that why can't the Europeans send more helicopters to Afghanistan? And the answer, to a very large extent, was those readiness problems that I mentioned earlier. The fact that if you looked into the details of the helicopter fleets in a number of NATO countries, they were actually able to deploy but a tiny fraction of the number of helicopter units, number of airframes that they had in their inventory. So I think that again, the readiness issue that I raised a few moments ago applies to Afghanistan, and then I very much agree with Emma's point about it also showed the European dependency on the United States in a number of key areas, especially long distance deployment and logistics. And I think, again, I very much stand by the remark I made a few moments ago that this was a good news story at the strategic level, that you had this many NATO countries willing to participate in a NATO operation this far from Europe. That's good news. But I think that it exposed, in addition to those readiness problems that I mentioned, it exposed that many of these European countries were terribly dependent on the Americans. To get their forces there and to supply their forces, once they arrived. So in areas like intra and inter-theater lift, many of the European countries were seriously dependent on the Americans. And I think that Emma's point in that regard is very, very well taken. We'll see what they do about that. We'll see to what extent NATO wants to devote X or Y or Z percent of its budget to what used to be called out-of-area operations. And, Afghanistan is about as far out of area as you can imagine from Europe. So the question is, do they want to buy more lift, strategic lift, and intra-theater lift to support these kind of operations once they deploy, considerable distances from Europe? We'll see. Because there's a lot of capability gaps that do need to be filled in these NATO countries. We'll see to the extent to which the alliance and the specific countries within that alliance are going to want to devote a lot of assets. I guess I should mention there's a small number of NATO countries, the French and British come to mind, right away, that do have better than average ability to project and sustain forces at considerable distances from Europe. But the French and the British are the exception. They're not the norm as far as that kind of a capability within the European NATO members. So back over to you.
Okay, thanks. We've had a couple of questions about the implications of potential rebalancing or pivots to Asia. I'll let our panelists think about that for a second while I answer one question that came up in the chat regarding the Black Sea, and particularly Georgia and Ukraine. The question was that there are already NATO members on the Black Sea: Turkey, Romania, Bulgaria. And what does that mean for the military balance there, and then potentially for supporting Ukraine or Georgia were they to become NATO members? And the answer is absolutely. There are NATO members on the Black Sea. The problem is that the Russians outgun everybody. Their Black Sea fleet has been upgraded in recent years so that it is far stronger than other naval components. They also have a strong air component, both in Crimea and in the Caucasus. The attitude of Turkey would be critical in defense of first Georgia and then also Ukraine. You have the Montreux Convention, which regulates the flow of forces through the Bosphorus. And if Turkey were to enforce that strictly, it'd be very difficult for NATO to bring forces to bear because of those restrictions. Similarly, Turkey borders Georgia, and if Turkey were willing to participate wholeheartedly, that would make the defense of Georgia much, much more attainable. On the other hand, when we talked about this in the working group, there was a lot of question about how deeply Georgia would want to, or rather Turkey would want to get involved in a conflict against Russia, with whom they have been improving relations. And there's a whole gradation of actions that the Turks could take, from strict neutrality up to full participation. And the working group, at least, was thinking that there'd be probably something in the middle maybe allowing NATO to operate, but not allowing it to use, not allowing Turkish forces to actually cross the border and engage the Russians. But it would be a critical consideration. So with that, we were down probably to our last question here, which is about the United States and its reorientation to the Pacific, and its encouragement of NATO to do the same. And does this mean that NATO is now going to be looking in a different direction and maybe make this discussion moot? Or how does that affect the enlargement discussion? And again, I'll start with Emma, since we put John on the hot seat a couple of times first.
Sure, yeah. So, so this is an active and ongoing debate, right, about the extent to which NATO should contribute to America's newfound, I guess we're pivoting to Asia again, but it's great power competition at this time. And I'm not sure that DC is of one mind about this. There are people arguing that NATO should be contributing to these missions. There are people in European capitals arguing that. And then there are people saying, no, NATO should, European members of NATO should instead step up and focus on European security. And I am much more of that latter mind, because I think that Europe is increasingly not a priority theater for the United States the way that it was during the Cold War, even during the post-Cold War period. And just in purely structural terms, right, if the US is in relative decline economically, militarily, if China is rising, if Russia is more militarily capable than it has been in recent years, something needs to fill the gap. And the US has carried the European members of NATO for many years. And those members are very capable of stepping up and filling that gap. And so from my point of view, I see this process of burden sharing, burden shifting to Europe as almost an essential part of shifting for the US, of shifting its focus to Asia. And I think, I did also note a second question there that I thought was particularly interesting about, how feasible is it that Europe will sort of rearm and remobilize and push back on Russia? And I think, that's also an open question, because I'm not convinced that European countries are going to pursue the line that America would want them to pursue, or would pursue if it was America taking the lead. But I do think those countries are perfectly capable of assuring their own defense and deciding what it is that they want to pursue with regard to Russia. So I think this is all sort of tied together with, if the US wants to focus more on Asia, it needs to talk more about burden shifting. And, just to bring us back to the question of enlargement, further enlargement is kind of a non-starter if you're already in a position of talking about pulling down US commitments to the NATO alliance. So I think in laying out the burdens that we would face from further enlargement, I think this paper does a really good service on that front.
John, I'll give you the last word.
Sure. Again, I find myself agreeing with Emma so much this afternoon. That's a good thing. I think she's. I think she hit a number of really important points here. Probably the biggest and most important point is perhaps the U.S. can't have it both ways. That the U.S. is increasingly concerned about China. The U.S. military is being oriented more and more and more in the direction of China. The Europeans are conducting some exercises there. There's a British carrier group with U.S. Marine F-35s on board, the British carrier, the Queen Elizabeth, operating along with U.S. and British warships in the Pacific. But that's not NATO. That's not a NATO commitment to the Pacific. That's a bilateral, one-off kind of arrangement for the U.S. and some other specific European countries like the French or the British, for example, who I mentioned before. Have they're the exception in most of NATO Europe, that they've got a reasonable ability to project fairly significant forces and maintain fairly significant forces far afield from Europe. So it's of those who have the capability, much less the willingness. European countries have got the capability to send like naval forces into the Far East to operate alongside the Americans, as part of sending a message to the Chinese, et cetera, et cetera. The British and the French are going to be the ones, at least in the near term, that are most able to do something like that. But getting back to my agree with what Emma said, and my remark that the U.S. perhaps can't have it both ways, is that if the U.S. is in fact reorienting its military focus more and more and more toward the Indo-PACOM region, and the U.S. probably should expect the European NATO countries to assume more of a burden in Europe. And if that happens, in fact, in order to help facilitate a U.S. reorientation toward the Pacific, then the U.S. needs to be realistic about how much the Europeans are, in fact, going to be able to project power outside Europe's immediate region. You know, some have physical limitations, they lack the lift, et cetera, logistics capability, as you know, we talked about earlier. But I think that if, in fact, there's this expectation that the U.S. can shift its focus to the Far East, and the Europeans will do more, as Emma suggested, well, that means the Europeans and NATO, you can't expect a whole lot from them in terms of operations out in Asia alongside the Americans. And getting back to the subject at hand, or those potential new entrants to NATO, the 5 countries that are the focus of CSIS's report, that if you are going to expand NATO to the east in Europe, with all the challenges associated with doing that we talked about this afternoon, then the United States should have an even further reduced expectation that the Europeans are going to be able to contribute much to Asia. Because, and again, there's going to be some exceptions. Like I said, French and British naval forces are just one that comes to the top. Possibly some air forces. But if you're going to bring Georgia, if you're going to bring Ukraine or Finland or some other combination of countries that are rather geographically exposed in Eastern Europe, you're going to bring them in and then expect the Europeans to do more to defend them. Then don't expect European NATO countries to commit much in the way of forces alongside the Americans out in Asia.
Great. Well, panelists, thank you very much. We've come to the end of our time. I greatly appreciate you joining us and having a really interesting discussion. For our audience, I point out again that the report is online along with the short video. Thank you for joining us.